Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming and making it in from all over tonight. We appreciate it. I'm Michelle Bergen. I go here. I have several kids and a senior at Nebraska Evangelical Lutheran High School, and we are excited to invite Norm to come speak with us, Pastor Emeriti. And I had no clue on all of his accolades until I got the email of all of the various things that he has done. I asked him how he wanted me to introduce him, and he said, the last person who introduced me said, a man who needs no introduction. But I counter that. I think it's a man who you need hours of introduction to hit everything that he has done. Not only is he a pastor emeriti, he is professor emeriti, he has done multiple mission trips to Guatemala, ran youth groups, worked for NASA, a organ transplant team lead trainer, a firefighter too. How do you do all of the mountain rescue team lead trainer? How do you do all these things in one life? I heard in a conversation that I was eavesdropping on earlier that by how old you lived in 48 different states? By a sophomore in high school, he had resided in 48 different states. So needless to say, we have the blessing of a wealth of knowledge to share with us tonight. Specifically, tonight he's going to share with us his time working with NASA on the lunar module, Apollo 11, and what was the other one? Oh, Apollo 11, 13. So that's what it's specifically for tonight. If he would so grace us with his knowledge again, I'd love to have him back if we could support him a second time, because he has multiple different topics that he can share his depth and his experience with us on. So if we could all just give him a round of applause and welcome him up and thank him for coming.
Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I will try to. We've got 6 hours, is that right? At whatever point you determine that you've had enough, we'll pull the plug. Back in a previous century, I worked for an organization, just a small group of people called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. It was the brain bank for the military, it started out, and then it expanded into the space program. It actually predated the space program as we know it. I did not apply for a job. They came to me. I was in the commercial sound business in Omaha, and these three guys wearing suits came in and said, we have a problem, and I said, yeah, I can tell that. But then they identified themselves as people from NASA, and they were having a problem, but they could not tell me what it was for, but a piece of equipment was failing. And they said, we understand that you work with power supplies, and we think the problem is with the power supply, and would you come to Houston and take a look at it and see if you can find out what's wrong with it. Well, I got to Houston. I did not know that they'd had electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and all kinds of people looking at it. Some of them had spent days looking at the schematics. And they had 3 8-foot tables end to end, and this schematic was rolled out on it. And they said, this is it. And I just started at one end, and I said, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem. This is for an aircraft, and when the voltage gets low, it fails. And they were just, huh? And they were using magnetic amplifiers, which is World War I technology. And I said, you got to replace these magnetic amplifiers with transistors, reference diodes. And so I got down to the end of it, and they said, well, when can you start? And well, I had to come back to Omaha and sell the business and all that kind of stuff. But that's how I got started with NASA. And so that whole process, I did several pieces of military ordnance, night vision optics, stuff like that. And so they gave me the title of electro-optical engineer. And I was the first and only at the time, electro-optical engineer at NASA. And I started with the Gemini program, went all the way through the Apollo program, all 16, and then the Soyuz project. Anybody aware that there was a rescue mission, a Soyuz module that the U.S.-Russian combination so that we could rescue each other's crews, and then got into Skylab. Does anybody know the significance of the year 2024? This is the 50th anniversary of the completion of the manned Skylab missions. It's the 45th anniversary of the return of the Skylab hardware. They allowed the orbit to decay, and it came back into Earth's atmosphere 45 years ago. And so most of the talks I've been giving as part of the NASA Speakers Bureau has been on the Skylab program. But you wanted Apollo 11 and Apollo 13, and so that's where we're headed. How many school students do we have here? High school, junior high, grade school, college professors? Okay. I know I'd eventually run out. My next one was old retired people, but I figured a bunch of people. To kind of set the stage for where we're headed with this tonight is I want to pose some questions. According to science, how old is the Earth? When you look at a science textbook, how old does it say the Earth is?
5 billion.
You're very close. The current accepted age of the Bible is 4.543 billion years old. That is billion with a B. Okay? Keep that in mind. According to the Bible, how old is the Earth? And you can round that off.
6,000 to 10,000 years.
6,000. It's actually, if you calculate it out, it's like 5,493 years. And if you've got a couple of hours, I can take you through the calculations. Okay. What was the purpose of the space program? Anybody know? What was the purpose of the space program? So America would what? Well, yeah, he said, so America could prove that they got to space first, right? Well, that's not quite right, because the Russians were up there too. We were trying to prove technology superiority over the Russians. And that seemed to be where everybody was headed, thinking that if you had rockets that could get you to the moon, you had rockets that could deliver explosives halfway around the world. And so that was the purpose of the space program, was to achieve technology superiority over the Russians. Now, we were running neck and neck. And in a little bit, I'll tell you what happened during Apollo 11 that showed just how neck and neck we were. Fourth question, what was NASA's hidden agenda? Anybody have a clue? NASA's hidden agenda was to prove number one. There were two of us that said the Earth is not 4.543 billion years old. It's only 6,000 years old. And we were kind of laughed at. But I was the only electro-optical engineer working for NASA at the time, so yeah. Sunday, July 20th, 1969. Anybody remember that date? What were you doing? What were you doing on Sunday, July 20th, 1969? You were what? Looking at the moon. A lot of people were watching television. I was watching television too, but it was a different TV set than the one you were watching. And we'll take a look at that. That date was when one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind was broadcast worldwide with a 40 millisecond delay. I had a delay in there, so in case there was a screw up, we weren't broadcasting. Anyway, you understand. But I kept saying that there's only going to be 3/4 of an inch of dust on the surface of the moon because it's only 6,000 years old. The consensus was that there was going to be between 15 and 35 feet of lunar dust based on the age of the moon. Lunar dust is about the consistency of talcum powder. And one of the big concerns was, could the men walk on the lunar surface? 1/5 the gravity of the Earth. And so they had these great big oversized boots, like snowshoes, so that they could float. They didn't know what was going to happen when they stepped on it. And in fact, they were so sure that there was going to be all of this deep talcum powder dust on there, that when they started working on the lunar module, the lander, they put 54-inch spikes on it. This is one of the 4 testers. These were training aircraft, so the astronauts could learn how to fly them. They crashed all 4 of them, determined that a human pilot could not fly one of these. And so Maggie Hamilton and I came up with a computer program to fly and land the module. This is what it looked like, these long spikes. The idea was that they would come down. There were sensors in the very tip, As soon as the sensors touched something, the rocket would cut off and it would drive those spikes into the ground, and the dust would billow up around the legs of this to the depth of where they had the ladder mounted. And in theory, they could come down the ladder and step off onto powder. You've probably all seen something like this. If you follow the blue line, take off from Florida, go out, circle around the moon, and there were some maneuvers that had to be done which had never been done before, and land on the moon. The command module would be circling the moon, and then it would take off and join up with that module, which had never been done before, and then return to the Earth. Maneuvers such as pulling the lunar lander out of the cargo bay of the Saturn V rocket. They had to blow the doors off, literally, and then turn around and maneuver, lock onto it, and pull it out. And so it was a very complicated maneuver. We hadn't done it successfully yet. And people say, well, why did we do it? If we hadn't done it before, why were we doing it with people on there? The Russians had a spacecraft going to the moon at the same time. Didn't know if it was manned or unmanned. Our attention was divided between our mission and where the Russian spacecraft was. We didn't want to run into them. We didn't know if they were going to shoot us out of the sky. Relations with Russia were not all that great. Still aren't. This is a picture actually taken from the command module. That's the lunar lander in the cargo bay. That's what they were looking at. And that cone-shaped thing was the connection, lock on and tie it to the command module, and then they had a hatchway that they could go between them. The target was the Sea of Tranquility. Perhaps if you recall hearing the live broadcast with a 40 millisecond delay of them coming in. You know, number one, the computer saturated, got the blue screen of death. So the computer took itself offline, and they were tasked with flying the lunar lander by hand, which could not be done, remember. They flew it in. They had 4 seconds of fuel left when it landed. They were short by several hundred miles. They did not land in the middle of the Sea of Tranquility where they had intended. They landed right on the very edge of it, and just barely. This is the inside of the lunar lander. No seats. They stood up. The yellow handles there were places that they could grab. All the controls were set to be operated one hand so they could hold on in case things got a little rough. Very bare bones. Down at the bottom, down here, that's the hatchway that they went out onto the leg and down the ladder on the leg. This was the video of the first astronaut to set foot on the moon. He came down the ladder, and people were wondering why was there a 9-hour delay between landing and when he went out. Anybody have a clue?
Wasn't there only 7 inches of actual dust?
What?
Wasn't there like 7 inches of actual dust instead of what they had portrayed as being,
There was 3/4 of an inch.
it was 3/4? Because I heard something about it was
Yeah,
7.
no, 3/4 of an inch, which is what I had been saying all along. And when they landed, I was on the control room floor in Houston, and like 40 technicians turned around and said, "How did you know?" And my answer was, "I read the book." But that created a problem. These 54-inch spikes did not drive into 15 to 35 feet of lunar dust, as I knew they wouldn't. And I'd been telling them those things aren't strong enough to support the lunar lander even in 1/5 gravity. And I says, if one of those would break off, it's going to tip over and the mission is over with, which is why we had a 40 millisecond delay in the audio. That was my job. Yeah, I was on the control room floor, and my job was Mission Operations Coordinator. I called the square dance. Wearing a headset, and I'm talking with the astronauts saying, "You've got 2 minutes left, you've got 5 minutes left, you're out of time, go to the next." And it was a manual about that thick. I think I've got a picture of it here. You had to stay on schedule. And there were things that got cut short, didn't get done because we were out of time. We had to move on to the next. But there was an 8-hour delay in there because when they touched down, they were on top of the ground. They didn't know if they could, they knew that they could get from the end of the ladder down. But could they get from down on the pad up to the first rung of the ladder without tearing their spacesuit? What would happen if their spacesuit got torn? Ever seen a balloon that you... That's what would have happened. And so during that 8 hours, we had 6 men in a swimming pool in Houston at the Houston YMCA determining could they jump up high enough to catch that first rung of the ladder. If they couldn't, the mission would have been scrubbed. Well, turned out that by placing their hands in the right position, they could make the jump. And so the mission was on, and we had them come out. The lunar lander, the module, that was the launch pad. The upper section there, which in the graphic is separated, but they were tied together. The upper section is where the 2 astronauts stood and controlled, had all that 254 switches that they had access to. And, okay, you're on the surface of the moon, your mission is done, and it's time to lift off and connect with the command module. What is the one thing that has to work in order for that to happen? How about the ascent engine? The rocket, which, by the way, was about the size of a small beer keg. Very small, right in the middle of the floor. And it was one of those that, very simple, but when you hit the fire button, full power, and it would ignite and lift off. Simple, right? a bit of a problem. Of all of the circuit breakers that have to connect is the engine arm circuit breaker. The area was so small, the spacesuits were so bulky that in the process of moving around in there, they broke off a circuit breaker. Of the over 200 circuit breakers, which one did they break off? You're right, the engine arm. Of all of those circuit breakers they could have broken off, it wouldn't have mattered. Engine arm. And that was the first, Houston, we've had a problem. You didn't hear it because I hit the mute switch on my console, so that did not go out to the press. And the comment was, we can't arm the Ascent engine. The circuit breaker is broken. And I cut in, I stepped out of my role, calling the square dance. I said, we have a workaround. They recognized my voice and said, well, if we've got a workaround, we'll live with that. And I did. I was not comfortable with that. Everything else had redundancy. We only had one rocket to lift off. And I was concerned about the electrical part of it. And I had built a phantom circuit around behind that where they could have gone around the fact that that circuit breaker was broken. They could have gone around it, armed all the circuit breakers on that panel by magic. And it would have armed the rocket. And so when they said, well, if Red says that we've got a workaround, I'm comfortable with that. And so my next comment was, do you still have your pen? In the sleeve of their spacesuits, they had an $800 ballpoint pen. And he said, yes, we do. And the stem of this is one of the circuit breakers in that panel. This is what they look like. And the cap broke off. And I said, see if you can push your pen into that and make connection. In other words, did just the stem break off, or did it break off inside the green box? And so he did have his pen. And by the way, this is another picture in the command module later with him holding the pen. They used it to make notes and all kinds of stuff. But he pushed it in and it made connection, everything came to life, and they were able to lift off. But that's how close they came to not getting off the moon. And like I say, it was the only circuit that did not have a redundant backup, and I just built a phantom circuit that would go around it. Nobody knew that but me, but that's the way we set it up. They came back from the moon, and perhaps you've seen this picture before. The astronauts looked like they're in World War I gas masks. We didn't know if they picked up something on the surface of the moon. We didn't know anything about it. And they tracked all that dust back into the module, and they were breathing that air that had that dust in it. So they were in quarantine for 2 weeks. Somebody had an Airstream trailer that they had on the aircraft carrier, and the President of the United States went out to that aircraft carrier and did a live broadcast welcoming them back. Now, I mentioned that in this whole process, the Russians were out there too. As we were coming in, we'd already separated from the command module. And we're in radio blackout, and we're tracking the Russian spacecraft. It did land at 875 miles an hour. We don't know if there were people on it or not, but that's how close we were to the Russians landing at the same time we did. Our concern wasn't so much, are we going to get there first, but are we going to run into them? Well, they were about 300 miles away from us, but they left a big grease spot, and we came back. Now, the question was, what happened to those spikes that were supposed to drive into, and that was to keep it from shifting? Remember I said you couldn't fly that? We had to have a computer fly it because it was impossible to fly. We'd wrecked 4 trainers doing it. And we had a computer program, the computer saturated, so we had to fly it manually. They were so short of their target that he was moving forward much faster than anybody would have anticipated. He was going like 30 miles an hour. And unless you got wheels, you don't land something at 30 miles an hour. And when we counted down to 10 seconds of fuel, he just eased back on the control and cut the engines. He was still moving forward just enough that the spikes broke off. And so they're now setting on the ski pads that were supposed to be covered with lunar dust. So maybe some things there that you didn't know about Apollo 11.
Just a question. While these things were happening in space, it got a little hairy. Did their wives know? Did their families know these things were happening, or are they in the dark?
The question was, did the astronauts' families know how tenuous it was?
Right.
No. They had the same feed everybody else had,
Is that
audio and video.
is that fair?
And well, it wasn't a matter of fair. It was a decision that I made that we're not going to broadcast a failure live.
Right.
And there was enough time in that delay that if something went south in a big hurry, I could just kill it. And I actually had a tape of, chicken scratch on a TV screen. We've had technical problems, and didn't have to use it, but I was ready. But that was, legitimate question. No, they were not privy to everything we knew on the floor. They had the same information that was being distributed to the press room, which I had control over. Now, question.
This is kind of dumb, but for some of the conspiracy theorists, some of them sometimes have like those little plus signs that you see in those pictures up there. What is the significance of the plus signs in there?
This was taken with a Hasselblad 300 EL, and I had put reticles. See, this is my job. I was the electro-optical engineer. And when I started there, they were using 35 millimeter cameras, and I said, "It ain't gonna fly," literally. And so I got Hasselblads with 50 millimeter lenses, and I had marks put on the reticle so that we had a measuring point. We knew with a 50 millimeter lens we could measure distances off of those points of reference.
You could measure how far that little yellow
Correct.
at the bottom. Yeah.
Correct. That was the reason we did it. And Hasselblad had a fit because we put optical glass, etched optical glass in front of, behind the lens in front of the film.
Like it could have altered the image a little
Right.
bit.
They were not happy. And I said, sorry about that. You sold us the camera, they're ours. You have no say as how we modify them. But that was the reason. That gives a point of reference to measure. And so anyway, there was a big to-do about how I knew that there was only going to be 3/4 of an inch of dust. But I had the last laugh. The 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, they distributed a commemorative coin. Guess what picture they put on there? The proof that it's only 3/4 of an inch. And I got 2 of these. So anyway, this happens to be a quarter. We actually had pocket pieces that all of the people that were involved had. So that's Apollo 11. And they asked me to cover a little bit of Apollo 13. I was somewhat involved in that.
One of the random questions, you mentioned a lot of things like could have potentially gone wrong, maybe rushed a little. Like in your mind, what were the odds of like everything being successful?
The question was, in my mind, what were the odds of things being successful? About a 10%. But we had to do it.
How did you like? I'm not sure like what your deep Christian views or whatever were kind of going in there when you were like told we need to do this, and lives could be, potentially on the line if things weren't successful. Like how did that kind of work around in your mind?
The question was, knowing what I did about the probability of success or failure, as a Christian, where was I with the possibility of somebody dying? And hey, it's like war. We treated the space program like we were in a war with Russia. And by that time, I was full military captain, and you kind of have to develop a military attitude. And this is war. If we lost them, it's part of war. And they knew that going in. They were all military as well. They volunteered for this mission. Nobody was forced to go on this. And so, yeah, we were very much aware that this is like a very complicated war maneuver. And the U.S. population didn't think of it as that, but we did, because NASA was military. And I worked for them for 2 years before they forced me into the Army. I went in as a civilian, and because I was flying military aircraft, I had to be military, so I got a direct. I went in as a captain. I didn't have to go through all that basic training, non-commissioned stuff. So, anyway, are we ready to move? Yeah, question.
Did you get a nice bonus from NASA for building that?
Did I get a nice bonus from NASA? No. Question was, did I get a bonus from NASA for having a workaround? No. Everybody was doing stuff like that. In those days, it did not matter what your training was, what your specialty was, what your MOS was, anything. If you had a solution to a problem, Let's hear it. My college degree was not in electro-optics. My college degree was in music. Hey, music is math. You got to count to 4. But I had gotten the patent on an electronic switch that was being used in grain elevators, the intercom systems in grain elevators all over Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, South Dakota, Colorado, Wyoming. And that's why NASA came to me with, can you solve this problem for us? And they didn't care. They didn't even know if I had a college degree. They just knew that I had a solution to a problem with grain elevators blowing up. And can you solve this problem for us? And I'm not sure. My NASA record never did reflect my college education. They didn't care. It wasn't until the shuttle program came in that they started getting, or the union came in, and you couldn't do anything outside of your operational specialty. And I told them, I said, you're going to kill somebody. And they did, because of people being limited to their specific tasks. During the Apollo program, we didn't care if the janitor came up with a solution or problem. Let's hear it. And in the space shuttle, I was in the vehicle assembly building, had a panel off of the lower stage of the Atlas V rocket, and I'm going to test something. I needed an oscilloscope. There's a Tektronix 525 sitting on a cart over there. I went over to get it and bring it over, and, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. Say what? That's a union electrician's job. I said, fine. Would you hook this thing up so I can use it? He started plugging it in, and I said, you just caused about a 9-month delay in the launch of this rocket. He says, what do you mean? I says, you've got that plugged into the wall. He said, well, what were you going to do? I says, you see that green box down on the bottom of the cart? You know what that is? No. And you're a union electrician, you don't know what an isolation transformer is? I says, before I touch that rocket, I've got to have the electrical ground isolated from earth ground. That's what that isolation transformer is for. If I'd have used it the way he plugged it in, I'd have blown 4 circuit boards, because I'd have taken the aircraft ground to earth ground, and it would have blown them. And I walked off the job. I was the last Apollo engineer to stay with NASA. And it was things like that. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. You ready to move on to Apollo 13? Anybody remember Apollo 13? Tell me about it, I forgot. Monday, April 13th, 1970 at 9:06 p.m. That's your time here. It was 10:06 where I was. I was in Florida. I was actually getting ready for Apollo 16 at the Cape, and I hear my name paged over the sound system, which is very irritating. It said, Red Shell, contact Houston, stat. So I knew something wasn't right. And so I called, I got to a phone and I called Houston and said, your liquid oxygen pump blew up. I said, it can't. There's no way. I said, well, it blew up anyway, and we've lost the spacecraft. You need to get to Houston now. We've got an F-4 Phantom taxiing up to the VAB right now. You need to get here now. And so I flew from Cape Canaveral, at a speed higher than the posted or public known speed record of an F-4 Phantom. We had to fly 25 feet off the ocean to stay under radar because you didn't want to get caught on radar flying over Mach 3, when Mach 2 was the maximum speed of the F-4. Captain Carr was the pilot, and I'm sitting in the back seat, and he says, "Yes, I've always wanted to do that." He lit the afterburners when we were upside down over Orlando, and he kept the afterburners on until we came into final approach in Houston. And we had to use a drag chute because we were going so fast. Anyway, that date was when there was an explosion. My liquid light, always before that, it was ours. When they thought it blew up, it was mine. And I said, I am not going to take responsibility. So I'm sitting in the back seat of an F-4 flying at Mach 3 in radio contact with Houston, and we're frantically trying to get stuff taken care of. And they tell me, oh, by the way, we've shut the entire aircraft down. All the electrical circuits have been turned off. I says, you've just created a major problem. We had never powered up a command module off of a battery before. We'd always had a Christie sitting on the ground plugged into it, and so the power-up sequence, we didn't care because we had as much power as we needed. We only had 40% of the batteries left, and we'd never powered it up manually off of a battery. And so when I got to Houston, I was in a simulator on my back, looking straight up. Maggie Hamilton is standing outside the door, and I'm giving her, from memory, surge currents on the magnetics, the transformers, in the module, command module, trying to come up with a startup sequence that would not blow a circuit breaker. If you blew a circuit breaker, you'd have to start all over. And so it was a little tense. I'd already been almost 20 hours without sleep when I got to Houston, and we were there for another day and a half coming up the sequence. We had to transmit the sequence up to the spacecraft so they could start it before we were finished with it. If we made a mistake at that point, there would not have been enough time to power it up. That's how close that was. But anyway, there was an explosion. That's an artist rendering. This is a picture of it. On the way back, they were able to take a picture of it. They disconnected and swung around and took a picture of it. So we knew we would have photographic evidence. If they didn't make it, we would have photographic evidence of what had gone on. And I said, aha, my liquid oxygen pump is intact. It wasn't the pump. Which I knew. The liquid oxygen pump was an electron accelerator, and there were no moving parts. There was no way it could blow up. This is another picture of it on the way back. This is what they call the oxygen valve module. That's what they said blew up. It was not that at all. It was the fuel cells, but it was oxygen tank number 2 that blew up. They reconstructed it from the photographs, and you can see there's the liquid oxygen pump right there, fully intact with the wire hanging. So I was exonerated. Whew. The problem was that there was a short circuit in the wiring harness that wrapped around the tank. Where the wiring harness crossed the welded seam in the tank, the difference between the temperature of liquid oxygen and the temperature of a glowing red wire was too great, and it relieved itself of that tension and exploded. Well, in their infinite wisdom, Houston decided to redesign the oxygen tanks. And my question was, why didn't the circuit breaker catch it? In fact, I asked that question 4 or 5 times on the flight from Florida to Houston. And I kept asking the question, why didn't the circuit breaker catch it? If we had an overload, the circuit breaker should have caught it. And so this was just before they disconnected, by the way. They disconnected and then spun around and took the pictures. It was a relatively simple maneuver. It was just a slingshot around the back of the moon. There was a lot of nervousness because they went behind the moon shortly after the explosion. Behind the moon, we did not have radio contact, had no way to talk to them. We had no telemetry from any of the instruments. We didn't know what was going on. And so when they came around and we finally reestablished radio contact, everybody was relieved. However, the temperature was like 42 degrees below zero in the module, and we hadn't started powering it up yet. By the way, it was heated by all of the transformers and the heat generated by the use of electricity that kept it at about 68 degrees in there. So without any current, electrical current, there was no heat. This is the control panel. You're actually looking straight down. You can see the 2 seats there. That hole in the middle is the egress door to go into the lunar module. And the problem had to be somewhere in there. And my question was, why didn't the circuit breaker catch it? I kept asking that. I made a nuisance of myself asking, why didn't the circuit breaker catch it? And the reason I asked that question because I designed the panel and I knew what all those switches were for and how they worked and what they were supposed to be. We had an immediate problem with oxygen. They had moved everybody, all 3 astronauts, into the lunar module. The lunar module had enough food, water, and air, critical air, for 2 men for 48 hours. We now had 3 men in there, and it's been about 32 hours, and they're running out of oxygen. And so how are we going to get enough oxygen in there? And I suggested, well, why don't we build a scrubber? And they had filters in both the command module and the lunar module to scrub the air so that it was breathable again. Guess what? The filters in the command module were not the same as they were in the lunar module. So you're trying to literally put a round peg in a square hole. Ta-da! I asked, do they have any 100-mile-an-hour tape? Does anybody know what 100-mile-an-hour tape is? 100-mile-an-hour tape is duct tape on steroids. It was developed during WWII to fix airplanes that got shot up. If you had a hole through the wing of an airplane, you put 100-mile-an-hour tape on it and sent it out again. And I asked, do you have any 100-mile-an-hour tape? And they did. Wasn't supposed to be there. But somebody had a roll of 100-mile-an-hour tape on board. And so I said, let's get our heads together and see if we can tape, using the tape and one of the oxygen tubes from a space suit and some other miscellaneous stuff that we could rip off of things, and see if we can make one of those scrubbers work well enough to get us by. And it did. And there's one of the square scrubbers taped to where the round one was supposed to be. It worked. In the meantime, all of the suits, that's the guys that get paid the big bucks, we're standing around in Houston. This is in Houston. We're standing around trying to solve various problems. And Maggie Hamilton and I are at the simulator trying to work things out. And but one of the things that was really critical was when they turned everything off, they turned off the navigation computer. You're in three-dimensional space, traveling at some 2,000 miles an hour. Where are we? Well, we'd had this problem before on an earlier mission. They had accidentally put in the wrong code sequence and turned the computer off. And it just happened that one of the astronauts on 13 had been on that mission and had gone through the process. And remember, I'm the electro-optical engineer. I got that job, I think, because my hobby was building telescopes. And we had a backup system that would allow them to triangulate off of stars to determine where they were in three-dimensional space. So everybody was in a panic. How are we going to know where they are and how they're going to get into the Earth's atmosphere safely? And we're sitting back there chatting. I says, yeah, let's take a look at that. Looking through this eyepiece, triangulate off of stars, calculate it, and we know the day timeline as the Earth rotates around the sun. We knew where that line was, and we can use that as an Earth reference point and stars. And the system was designed so that you could take 3 stars and get a triangulation on where you were. I wasn't satisfied with that. We did 4. And had a pretty good idea. We reset the navigation computer once it was up, and we got back. In the meantime, everybody was in a panic, trying to figure it out. And by the time the flight engineer and all of the other people were comfortable with what was going on, we already knew where we were and how we were going to get in. And we'd already started moving the USS Hornet into the right position as the recovery ship, because we'd never landed that far south before. And the Hornet was actually an emergency in case something got off. It was further south, almost to the equator. And so anyway, there's a whole dramatic thing about when they re-entered. The corona around the heat shield blocked the radio signal longer than people expected. And I kept saying, don't worry about it. It's going to be longer because they came in at a different angle. but we're cool. And Apollo 13 landed closer to its recovery vessel than any other space landing. It was so close that the captain of the Hornet was taking evasive action because it looked like it was going to land on the deck. It landed within 300 yards, the length of 3 football fields from the Hornet. Sigh of relief when they landed. They had less than 30 seconds of oxygen left in the capsule. The astronauts popped the door before they were in stable 1, in other words, with the nose pointing up. They popped the door before they had the halo around it to stabilize it. Even a small wave, had it hit that open hatch, would have taken it straight to the bottom. And they would not have been able to get out in time. So anyway, we got things stabilized. They came out. They were lifted onto the Hornet. That's how close they were to the Hornet. They picked them up with the crane on the Hornet on board, lifted the spacecraft on, and I kept saying, why didn't the circuit breaker catch it? And my wife was irritated one night. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I sat up. I've got it. Huh? Go back to bed. It dawned on me what the problem was. Can you spot it? This is the circuit. This is the circuit that it was in. Here's the problem. Too much information? Okay, let's zoom in on that. It's up in panel L170B. Do you see what the problem is yet? That circuit breaker was a 20 amp circuit breaker. It was supposed to be a 0.2 of an amp circuit breaker. Somebody left this decimal point out. Every command module up to that point had been built with a 20 amp circuit breaker on it. We had a spacecraft at Launch Pad B with a 20 amp circuit breaker in it. I went down and crawled under the panel and took that 20 amp circuit breaker out of a ship that was going to be launched in 4 weeks. Took that circuit breaker out and put a 0.2 of an amp circuit breaker in. But that was the problem. Just a simple switch. And that, I was not Mr. Personality at NASA. I was not permitted to talk to the press. After I decked the reporter in the back hallway, he wasn't even supposed to be in that hallway. And he was running down the hall. I was running down the hall. He was running down the hall beside me with a camera in my face and a microphone held out there. And I just hauled off and decked him. And the fact that he was in a restricted area without clearance got him in trouble, not me, although he tried. And so after that, they said, why don't you just stay in the background, which I was very comfortable with. I was not comfortable with dealing with the press, because the press, in the first place, they asked questions. They had no idea what they were asking. They had no idea how we answered them. You know, they didn't understand what we said, and they were going to make it up anyway. And I just had a short fuse with that. But anyway, that's Apollo 13. Perhaps some things you didn't know about Apollo 13 before. Has anybody ever been to Cape Canaveral? Cape Kennedy? You've taken the public tour, right? How would you like to go on a behind the scenes tour, stuff you don't see on the tour? Okay, the buses will show up here in about 10 minutes. Let me get to the right place here. Launch pads A and B, Cape Canaveral. Most of these are Apollo 11, some of them are Apollo 13, but a lot of these pictures I took, so I have permission to use them. This is the Vehicle Assembly Building. The Vehicle Assembly Building is the largest one-story structure in the world. It's rather significant. It's 526 feet tall, it's 716 feet long, and 518 feet wide. 124,428,000 cubic feet. A big place. In fact, it is so big that it creates its own weather. Because of the changing atmosphere outside, it could be raining inside. A constant headache. Most of my work was done on level J, which was pretty close to the top, and it was a whole different atmosphere up there than down on the ground. Weird. Still that way today. This is the command center, the control building. I had an office in the corner of that building, although I didn't spend much time there. I also had one of the temporary buildings that were permanent, the portable buildings out lined up. I had one of those assigned to me. And this is looking straight up at the gantry crane at the very top. That gantry crane could lift several thousand tons. Could lift an entire Atlas V loaded Atlas V rocket up. This is the VAB being refitted for the shuttle program, by the way. Had the extra curve in it for the shuttle. This is an Atlas V rocket being assembled at ground level in the VAB. They'd assemble it and then tip it up, pick it up, and slide the next unit under it. That's the business end of a Saturn V rocket. And that's where all the fire and smoke came out. Give you a reference to the size of those nozzles. And by the way, that was it. What you're seeing is the entire rocket engine. The fuel mixture up at the top is very small. And then they had the exhaust cone. They don't let you see that when you go on the public tour. That's me 50 years ago, and we're doing some electronic work, checking something on one of the rocket engines. And this is tipping the Atlas V up, then assembled at ground level, and they tipped it up. And then you see they kept adding the sections. It was like a big Tinker toy. You just kept adding sections to it. And this is the command module for Apollo 11 as it was being delivered to the Vehicle Assembly Building. I had gone to San Diego and flown with that all the way back to Houston and rode the barge up the canal and supervised the loading onto the lowboy and bringing it into the VAB. I drew the short straw because I was the one that approved that one to be used for Apollo 11. We're picking it up, getting it ready to set on top of the rocket, and this is the command module, the service module, and the upper half of the cargo bay. And we're getting ready to drop the lunar module into the cargo bay of Apollo 11. And this was all done in much haste. And there you can see the retro rocket that allowed it to slow down coming into the moon. They had pulled the lunar lander out of that by that time. And this is level J. That's where I work most of the time, right there. Putting the finishing touches on it before the astronauts got in it. The largest self-powered machine in the world, not counting mining equipment. This was the largest self-powered surface machine in the world. They had two of them. This was Fritz, Hans and Fritz, they named them. And it took a small army to run it. I don't know if you can tell, but the roadway that it's on is gravel. With the rocket on it, they could not get concrete strong enough to support the weight. So it was a gravel road. And it operated with, there were two operators in the cab. There were two walkers in front of it in radio contact with them. And there were two walkers behind it. And there were four walkers on each side. And you'll see why in a minute. Big, big piece of machinery. You can see the car there. That's a van, to give you an idea of the size. This was a launch pad. This is the base. It doesn't have the conning tower on it yet. It's just the base. And the transporter would go under it, raise it up, and move it to the VAB. The rocket would get put on it, and then they would move it out to the launch pad. But that's the way it started. And then they put the towers on them. We had a minimum of 5 launch towers ready to go at all times. And so here are 3 of them that are ready to move to the VAB. They had gantry walkways that swung out, and different missions had different numbers of them. Apollo had 7, and this happens to be the astronauts, the one that the astronauts came across. I've got another picture of that later. But they just swung out of the way. Some of them were fuel, some of them were liquid oxygen, some of them were just access to critical panels. And this is the crawler, having picked it up and ready to move it. You can see the gantries that are going out to the various levels. This gave technicians and the astronauts access to where they needed to be. This is Apollo 11 coming out of the vehicle assembly building. And the reason that they had all these people was that they had to watch, make sure that it stayed vertical. You're talking about lots and lots of weight. And if it got a little bit off, or if it got to rocking, and it was You can't tell too well, but that first section goes downhill, and then it levels off. So the crawler had to jack up the low side and lower the high side to keep the rocket within 1/10 of 1 second of arc of being vertical. And again, this is Apollo 11. I'm actually in a helicopter taking the picture, but it's almost down to where it levels off. It's almost to the bottom of that slope to where it levels off. There's the astronauts going in. Okay, I zoomed in. Sorry about that. I'm not that close. There are the astronauts getting ready. They had technicians in the gantry that were checking their spacesuits, make sure all the connections were right, pressure testing, all that kind of stuff. This is Apollo 11 taking off. I did not take that picture. I was not that close. I didn't want to be that close. I was behind 2-inch thick bulletproof glass. I want you to notice the crowd of people standing on the ground between us and the rocket. If that rocket had exploded on takeoff, there's a question of whether the glass would be sufficient to protect us. But there were a bunch of idiots, NASA employees, sorry, that wanted to stand out there and watch it take off. This is some of the technical crew in the Launch Control Center watching 11 take off. This is Houston, and that's what it looked like. If anybody wondered. By the way, it's been reconstructed. Anybody know that? They have restored the Apollo Mission Control room in Houston back to its original condition, and it is now a museum. That's Mission Control Center. See somebody on the far end with his head in his hand? That's me. I don't know why. That's just how I worked. I had my head in my hand all the time. I'm following line by line through the program and watching the clock and going through that. And here's another shot. Again, I'm holding my head. I didn't know I was doing that. That was my control station. You can see the book. This is the Apollo 11 master program. And it was single space, typed on a typewriter, each thing and when it was supposed to happen, and I had to follow that. And I had a headset, and I had an extra button on my control panel that I just thought I'd label it. You know, it didn't have a label on it. And this is, again, somebody's got his head in his hand. I don't understand that. Now, a lot of you don't know. The control room floor doesn't control anything. All the work is done in the back rooms. We had screens and a dial, and you could turn your screen to any of several different signals from the back room. And the work was done back there. And if something needed to be changed, you had to speak into this operator type headset to the technician on the other end to tell him to change it. You couldn't control anything. All the work was done in the back room. This is part of my crew. Ken Stamps is over there kneeling down. He never used a chair. He always knelt down. I don't know why. I didn't question it. That's the way he worked. The long-haired gal in the middle there, that's Maggie Hamilton. She was the one that wrote the program for the onboard computer for the Apollo program. And some of my other compadres, and they're in the back room. This is another back room, and I want you to notice who's standing around telling war stories and who's doing the work. This was a United Press International photo that was taken. I said, why would you do that? All the suits are standing around telling war stories, and it's the ladies in the back that are doing the work. This is the press room, and one of my jobs was to make sure that the press room got appropriate information. Yes. And I filtered it rather heavily. This is Mark. He's at the control panel for the camera that sent the first video pictures back from the surface of the moon. I had designed and built that camera, and I had told them that the image is going to be 180 degrees out of phase, and you need a processing amplifier so you can correct that when the signal comes back. Nobody believed me. I put my own personal processing amplifier in the rack. And does anybody remember seeing that first image that came back? What was wrong with it? It was upside down. And as you watch that picture turn right side up, that's me turning a knob on my processing amplifier. But I was wrong. It was not 180 degrees out of phase. It was 182 degrees out of phase. But I had just guessed at it. That was a pretty good guess. This is a publicity picture. That's me in the middle of the back row. 50 years ago. I looked different then. I forgot to shave this morning, so I did that morning. But I put this picture in there to show you how to tell who is who. The men wearing ties are the engineers. The men without ties are the technicians. Not a formal dress code, but if a technician showed up with a tie on, they made him take it off. And if an engineer showed up without a tie, somebody gave him a tie. I kept 3 or 4 ties in my office just in case, I came from someplace where I wasn't wearing a tie, like flying from California to Houston. The only one, the military, the guy in the Army uniform there, that's the medical officer, the flight medical officer. And he always wore military uniform. The rest of us were military too, but we wore civilian clothes. This is Maggie Hamilton. That stack of papers is a printout of the navigation computer software on Apollo 11. You've seen the old green fanfold paper? That's what's stacked up. That's the printout of that program for the navigation computer. Probably one of the smartest women I ever met. This is a page out of my logbook. You students, do your science teachers make you do logbooks yet? You don't know what I'm talking. Well, then they're not having you do that. By the time you get to college, if you take college classes, you'll have to take do logbook. Everything gets written in your logbook. And this is the kind of stuff that's in logbook. Everything that we did, all the mathematical calculations we did on a slide rule. Texas Instruments had just come out with the first digital calculator. We didn't trust it. And for good reason. It would round off, and we're dealing with such close tolerances that we couldn't stand the rounding off. A slide rule is a fairly simple piece of machinery. The longer they are, the more accurate they are. I had a collection of them. Everybody used them. I had mine on a holster on my hip all the time. And there's some of mine. But I had, in my portable building at Houston, I had a 7-foot-long slide rule for accuracy. And this was the one that I carried all the time. It still slides. Hence the name slide rule. I paid $35 for that, and that was a lot of money in those days. But everybody used them. Everybody had one within arm's reach all the time. This is a picture of my logbook. And I forget exactly what this is. I don't know where they dug that up, but I asked you when I got on the NASA Speakers Bureau, I said, "Can I have one of my old logbooks?" No. I says, "Could you maybe take a picture? Because I'm going to be talking to school kids and they don't know what a logbook is." And so this is a picture they sent me of one of my old logbooks. I don't know where they found it, but it should have been destroyed years ago. But everything went in there. And I think that's the reason I was always holding my head, because I was writing in my logbook. Everything that happened. All of my calculations. If I printed something out from a scope, the strip got taped in there. Everything went in the logbook. And that's the only way that we could keep track of everything. You could go back through the logbook and see what you're doing. Even today, with computers, NASA engineers still keep a logbook. And if your high school science teacher doesn't have you keep a logbook of what you do in class, your college professors definitely will. So it is 8:07. And we've been at this for an hour and a half. Any questions at this point? Man, I must have bored you to death.
So, you flew from California. You ever at Vandenberg Air Force Base out there? Or?
Oh, yeah. Area 51. Yeah, all those places. Yeah, people often ask, well, how did you get around? And the answer is very carefully. We had a transportation system. We had 4 or 5 Learjets, and the number varied from time to time. And so if I needed to go someplace, I could jump in one of those. We had several Beechcraft twin engines that we could get around in. My personal airplane was a Cessna 310D with Fletcher tanks, and sometimes I would end up doing that too. We had OV-10s. If we had something to transport that wasn't too big, that back door right there of the OV-10 would swing open and you could put something fairly good sized in there if you needed to transport it. And since we were dealing with classified military stuff, we couldn't just ship it UPS. UPS wasn't around then, but you couldn't just ship it. You had to go get it and approve it. Oh, they hated me. And then if you had a big piece of equipment, you used the Guppy. Converted transport plane. This thing, in theory, could not fly. But it was big. You could put 8 Huey helicopters in one. You could put train cars in there. We never did, but it was big enough you put a train car in there. Whole train. Anybody recognize that? That's the command module for Apollo 11. We're loading it in California. And I was taking pictures to document it. This is an old World War II, a converted World War II transport plane is what it is. And they just build the big thing and fix the nose so it would swing out. And question?
Have you ever had the chance to visit SpaceX?
No, I haven't been down there since then.
I always, at the end of the year in my calc class, I always made sure that I showed a film of SpaceX. And I wanted the kids to see it. It amazed me how they set up rockets and then they brought them back and had them.
Oh, yeah. That wasn't the case in 13.
No.
You had to go.
What was so amazing to me was the age of the people. I said, now you look over, where everyone is standing watching what was happening. They were all college, probably 23
Yeah.
students.
Yeah, we were all kids.
And they were all kids.
Yeah, we were all kids.
That could be anything.
That's it. By the way, they made 2 of those, and they are no longer in service. The airframes have reached their maximum life. They have 6 Belugas now. Same concept, only bigger, that they use to transport stuff. Question?
After this impressive NASA career, how and when did God lead you into ministry?
How did God lead me into the ministry? Kicking and screaming, no. All the while I was working for NASA, I was involved in the youth program at church. And so when I left NASA rather hurriedly, I went to finishing school. I went to the seminary and became a youth pastor. That was the helicopter that I had access to, just a Huey 1B. Question?
Some of these are your personal photos.
Yes.
Were they ever classified? How
Yes.
is it that you could take these and now show them to us?
Well, because we're streaming this, I've left some pictures out. Some of them are still classified, but I have permission to use them because I took them. But I have left some of them out because I don't have control over where it's going. But yeah, some of the pictures are classified. I've got some other pictures, some other projects I worked on that are still classified and I can't show here. But anyway, if I needed to get someplace quickly, we had what we called taxi service. F-4 Phantoms. The F-4 Phantom is the aircraft that proves that a brick can fly if you put enough power on it. At the time, the F-4 was the only aircraft that could match the vertical takeoff acceleration of an Atlas V rocket. So we used them as chase planes. Plus we had we had a bunch of them that pilots would come back from Vietnam. They'd flown their maximum number of missions, but they still had enlistment time. And so they were assigned as taxi drivers for NASA. And the first time that I needed to get someplace in a hurry, I needed to get from Houston to Cape Canaveral to Bohemia, Long Island, the Dayton T. Brown Testing Lab. I was going to have to get up there quickly, so I took a taxi. Well, I'm walking out to the flight line. I'm in a flight suit, and I've got my helmet, and I've got a briefcase that he assumed was charts and stuff, and it was stuff that I needed in Bohemia, Long Island. And so he's sitting in the back, and he points to the front seat. And okay, so I get in, and we take off from Florida, and he gave me the flight plan. I flew up to Bohemia, Long Island, and as we're coming in for a landing, he says, "By the way, how many hours you got in an F4?" I said, "Counting today?" And I said, "Well, about 4.5." And so we went from Bohemia, Long Island to Houston, and I sat in a Link trainer for 4 hours getting tested, you know. So the guy that was flying was a Top Gun instructor, almost ready to get discharged. Officer never gets discharged, but you know what I mean, going off of active duty. And so he certified me in an F4 as a transport pilot. And so that means I could take an F4 anytime I needed. And it came in handy several times I needed. But the F4, supersonic aircraft, most of these were so shot up from Nam that they were no longer combat worthy, so they gave them to us. And, but they were kind of a sports car. My little homemade BD-10 could outperform it, but and I had several F4 pilots that wanted to fly my plane, my little home-built, because it was a supersonic home-built aircraft. Anyway, you can do all kinds of stuff in them. This is breaking the sound barrier. Do you know that when you break the sound barrier, there's a cloud momentarily as it transitions. It's called maximum dynamic force. That's when all the vibration and everything, and once you get through it, you're fine. They could be refueled in the air, and we had several missions where they did have to refuel them because the chase planes had to stay in the air, and if there was a delay in takeoff, why the tankers would take off and refuel them. Could land on an aircraft carrier. Did that once with my entire youth group watching. That's a whole nother story years later. Fairly simple aircraft to fly. The old mechanical gauges, you know, fine. None of this fancy electronic stuff. Throttles over there on the left, this starting and all that. Afterburner. Had a radar unit in the nose, which proved to be very helpful at times because it would do both objects and weather. So if we were flying someplace and needed the latest weather, we could get it live. Commercial airplanes don't have the resolution this one did. And that's me in an F4. Question?
Wernher von Braun worked at NASA.
Yeah.
What was his role in all of the Apollo missions?
He was actually a rocket scientist. Lived in Houston. My wife and I had backyard barbecues with him and his family on a few occasions. We were all kind of a close-knit group, although I don't think any of us would admit it. we usually ended up talking shop, and the wives would go off and talk about raising kids and all that kind of stuff. But anyway,
You had mentioned that your colleagues were amazed that you knew that the earth was as young as it was. Did that affect their Christian outlook at all afterwards?
okay, the question was, colleagues knew that I held to the position that the earth was 6,000 years old, and they were, 4.454 billion. Don't know if at the time it had any effect on their Christian outlook. They would try to justify it in a number of different ways. But after 11, when they said, "How did you know?" and my smart aleck remark was, "I read the book," I was asked officially, would I make a presentation on how I came to that conclusion, because it was obviously right. And so I presented the Norman Shell hamburger and pizza theory of creation. I reduce everything to food concepts. And so I did well, in those days it was overhead projectors and acetates, and 35 millimeter slides and a carousel slide projector. But I did my initial request, there were 35 people in attendance, and 5 weeks later I was asked to repeat it, and I had over 100. And all of these were eggheads, guys that knew everything. Just ask them, they'll tell you. And I presented it twice, and I have used that a number of times since becoming a pastor, both in church settings and school settings. But it's, I can prove, I have scientific proof that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And take a look at the picture, folks. 3/4 of an inch. And at the rate of lunar dust buildup that they'd calculated from earlier missions, it comes out to 604 years. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know. I don't know if anybody was converted, but they asked me to explain how I came up with that figure, and I did, in their terms, reducing everything to food concepts. And I still use it. In fact, the presentation I'm using today, I used the original flip chart drawings that I made back when I did it for Houston to start with. So those are 60 years old.
So during both the American and the Russian space programs, there's some instances of astronauts and cosmonauts dying.
Oh, really?
No, I'm not. Well, I know you know that. I just meant for context. So is this considered when this happened, the other side see it as oh, some of theirs died, that's fun, or was it seen as, oh, that's kind of sad?
Well, you're looking at two sides of it. The question was, we know that both U.S. astronauts and Russian cosmonauts died in the respective space programs, and what was our reaction to that?
Yeah.
Well, internally, we considered it a tragedy. It was, even though they were enemies politically, they were doing the same thing we were, and so when one was lost, we felt it. The problem was we have no idea how many Russian cosmonauts died because Russia never said that a space mission was manned until it was all over and successful. So we don't know how many there were. I have heard radio transmissions of cosmonauts who realized that they were not coming back. And that, that hurts, because we were all in the same business. Politically and the press, see, Russians a failure and we're successful. Well, we lost astronauts too. We lost astronauts on the ground doing an experiment that I said wouldn't work. Sorry about that. Why they had a pure oxygen atmosphere in that capsule for that test, I have no idea. I said you should use nitrogen. They used oxygen and it caught fire. And when I left NASA, I said, your attitude is going to kill somebody. 6 months later, Challenger.
That's sad.
Yeah. And it was for something that I told them wasn't going to work. The O-ring that the Thiokol Corporation had made, when it got down to freezing, it lost its elasticity and would leak. I told them that. And Thiokol told them that. They launched anyway. And guess what happened? The O-ring leaked and it blew up. Duh. But I was out of the program by then. Questions?
With mission control, comparing 50 years ago to now, what's the same and what's very different?
You talking about the personnel on the floor?
Just mission control in general.
Mission control in general. Now, okay, let's include the back room too, because they're the ones that actually did the work. Mission control, that was the press coverage, and they really couldn't control anything. Today, in NASA mission control, those are people that are certified to do a specific job, and they can't do anything but that job. Now, we're privatizing the space exploration process, and it's going back, not all the way, but it's getting back to what NASA was when I was working for it, where it didn't matter who you were, what your degree was in, even if you had a degree, didn't matter what your job was. If you had a solution, let's hear it. And we're getting back to that in the privatization, but NASA itself is still hung up on this is your job title, this is your job description, you don't do anything outside of that. It's what I consider a very hostile work environment when you're dealing with people's lives. You're not allowed to do anything outside of your specific job title. It's changed, unfortunately. Did that spark your day? Yeah, NASA today is a very inefficient organization financially because people just, they've limited their brain trust, the brain power that they could have. So, Greg.
The engine on the Saturn V is still the largest rocket compared to SpaceX, where they have 35.
Yeah, the problem with the Atlas V, the question was, is the Atlas V rocket engine still the biggest one? Yes, and the reason for that is that they started going with more rockets of smaller size because there's a vaporization problem in the nozzle that they never could fix fully. They did all kinds of things. They moved, afterburner tubes and all kinds of stuff around in there. They never did get it to where it was not a problem. Literally, they could flame out. By going to a smaller throat, the problem doesn't exist. And it has to do with icing. And so by going to more rockets of smaller size, more rocket motors of smaller size, they don't have the throat size that causes the icing. It's like a carburetor on a car. The big racing carburetors with the big throats always had an icing problem. And it's because as the fuel expands rapidly, it cools off. And that was the problem. Yeah, Atlas V was a very inefficient engine, and they went with a solid fuel then on the shuttle, and they had other problems with it too, because the solid fuel was solid in sections, and they put the sections together with Thiokol O-ring seals, and we know what happened there. But yeah, good question. Question?
Do you know what the efficiency of rockets are now?
Pardon?
The efficiency of rockets now?
The ones that are being used today are about 85% efficient. The Atlas V was about 45%. So, and partly because they've gone to smaller engines with smaller throats and don't have that icing problem, makes them more efficient. That's why if you're building a race car, you don't put one great big huge carburetor on it, you put two smaller ones, and then constantly tweak them so they're together. So anyway, questions, comments? Question?
That accident you were talking about, the boys were asking about that, could you detail what happened there?
The what?
That accident you were talking about with the oxygen before Apollo 11, could you explain that in further detail? The boys were asking about that.
Oh, with the pure oxygen.
That was the
Oh, yeah. They were doing a pressure test of the command module on the pad. Live test, had astronauts in it and all that. And they pressurized it, but they pressurized it with pure oxygen because that's what they had. Pure oxygen is very flammable. It will cause things to burn that normally don't burn. But they pressurized it with pure oxygen, and there was a spark. We have no idea where it came from, but it set it off, and they had absolutely no chance of ever getting out of there.
Were those astronauts, were they going to be on the mission?
They were. This was the final check of the crew that was going to go on Apollo 4. No, they weren't going to be one. This was Apollo 4 that they were going to be on, but this was their final check. But they were in the capsule for Apollo 1, but it wasn't the Apollo 1 crew. And by the way, Apollo, they canceled that mission. There was no Apollo 1 because of the accident.
Can you comment on the movie interpretations or Hollywood's interpretations?
Oh.
Apollo 13 and then the one about Neil Armstrong.
Well, those are highly dramatized. Has anybody seen Apollo 13? I'm in it. They used some footage of the control room floor, and I happen to be on the. No, you can see the back of and I'm holding my head in my hand. Very, very highly dramatized. They took some significant liberties with the facts. And like Apollo 13 never talked about the circuit breaker problem. They got hung up on the stirrer in the oxygen tank to stir it to keep it so it was turning into a gas at the proper rate. And yeah, they just took a lot of. Yeah, I have yet to see a movie, even a so-called documentary, that is faithful to the facts. They've got to doctor it up and twist it around and make personal story out of it and all that kind of stuff. And they miss the what was really going on. At least what was going on from my perspective. And I was only on the control room floor part of the time. I was in each control room floor team was given a color. There was the white team and the blue team and the black team and so on. I was in the maroon team. The maroon team was all of those people. Most of us were payload specialists, and they would pull us in as needed. And there were all the maroon jokes. Oh, you're just a bunch of maroons. Think about it. So anyway.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, let there be